Hello, and welcome to continued discussion about fiscal policy. We're going to do some review in this particular lesson. In other words, this isn't necessarily new, but we will be using it with a different graph just to show the interconnectedness of the ideas. So first of all, recall our multipliers. The income multiplier having the equation 1 over 1 minus marginal propensity to consume, and the tax multiplier being negative and marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus marginal propensity to consume. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at a recessionary gap and an inflationary gap. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at it in terms of our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, as opposed to the aggregate expenditure. So here we have the long run aggregate supply curve, and we've got our short run aggregate supply curve. And for whatever reason, let's just, in this particular scenario, where the economy is operating at A and it should be operating at B. And so in this particular scenario, the government has two choices in its policy. It can increase spending, or it can decrease taxes. And when it does either of these, it will cause real GDP to rise, and then price levels will rise, and that will inspire companies to hire more people. Now, the thing is we want to do the right choice, or the preferred choice, and there is a preferred method here. And as we work through here, we're going to discuss the merit of a tax multiplier or an income multiplier in this particular scenario, and we've maybe talked about it in class, so you might have some clue as to where we're going. In this economy, notice that we are looking at a $0.2 million, or I should say, I guess it's trillion, but I wrote down million. But anyway, the idea is we're $2 million off target, and our multiplier is 7.75, and we want to close a $2 million gap. So just ignore that and just use the 2 million as the idea. Now, because we're closing a recessionary gap, we have to first identify whether the preferred tool is the income multiplier or the tax multiplier. But I do want you to do the calculations for both. So here, I've got the income multiplier, and I've worked it out, and we see that the income multiplier is 4 and the tax multiplier is -3. And so what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to plug this in. I need to close a $2 million gap, and so I divide my $2 million by the 4, and I find out that in order to close the gap, this economy would have to spend $500,000, or in order to close the gap, they would have to decrease taxes by $250,000. And so the idea here is, well, what is going to create the better outcome for the economy? Well, keep in mind something going on here. The economy is sluggish. We're in a recession. So the government is already dealing with low tax receipts. And while a tax cut could help and would help inspire some additional activity, when we're looking at the government debt condition, they're already dealing in deficit. And so what they have to do in order to be kind of, I guess, frugal is try to figure out, well, what's going to lead to the lowest deficit if we attempt to expand the economy. And notice that they could spend $500,000. That means the deficit would increase by $500,000, or they could decrease taxes by $250,000. That would mean that the deficit would increase by $250,000. So what we should see here is that when we're trying to figure out what the government should do, it just makes more sense for the government, looking at its deficit issues, to spend the $500,000 in food stamps, in job programs, in road construction, in infrastructure, internet expansion, all of those kinds of things, rather than cutting taxes. Now, that's not to say that cutting taxes is not going to create benefits, because it would increase consumer spending and business spending. But if we're talking about this in terms of what's best for the national debt or annual deficit, it would just be a lot simpler for the government to build in those temporary programs. And remember, when the government's attempting to close a gap, it should implement the policy when it's needed and then get rid of it when it's not. So any of these spending programs would have to have specified implementation and expiration dates, so that they're there when it's needed and gone when it's not. So what we would do in this economy in recession, if we're really trying to be fiscally conservative, we would simply increase important infrastructure spending and support for families in need. Now, the next is a contractionary policy. And here, notice what's going on is we are operating beyond the point. So we should be at B, but we're up here at A. And so we're kind of a hyperactive economy, and we're having lots of inflation. We need to push that aggregate demand back to B. So the things that we can do, we can raise taxes or we can cut spending, and either of these will cause real GDP or the price level to fall. And remember, this isn't always a bad thing, because at real GDP, if we're in this inflation, then that means the buying power is falling. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the same figures just to keep it consistent, and we got to figure out, are we going to use the tax multiplier or the income multiplier? And in this instance, we have the same MPC, and we're going to close the same gap. So first, we go ahead and identify, let's just move that up, identify what we'd have to do in this economy. And we've got this inflation, and the government could decrease spending by $500,000, or they could increase taxes by $250,000. Now remember, at this point, the government has lots of money coming in. This is true, but they can use that money. Well, first of all, if they spend money, if they cut the spending, they would be able to decrease the economy, and they pull out about $500,000 in the economy. But we're still experiencing inflation, so their goal is to actually limit the amount of funds in the economy at a larger level. So what they would do is they would increase taxes by $250,000. And what this does is it gets even less money in the hands of people, businesses and households. So they spend a little bit less, and that ends up bringing the economy back down to its long-run potential at no unemployment and no inflation, or I should say target inflation of 2% and target unemployment of about 4.5%. And they can get this done more quickly by increasing taxes. Now, that the reason, just to kind of clarify here, the reason that that tax multiplier is different is because the government does tend to spend what it brings in. And so that weakens the effect of the tax multiplier relative to the income multiplier. But this can safely be done if we've got an overactive economy and we increase the taxes. So long as the government takes those revenues and uses it to pay off old debt, or put it in a rainy day fund if we don't have old debt, although I don't think that's likely, at least in our lifetimes, then this is beneficial in two ways. It reduces our spending and brings those price levels back into manageable positions, keeps us from having a lost buying power. It sort of evens up that buying power, and it allows the government to pay down debt that may have accumulated at a different period, or save money for a time when they need it in the future for a recession. Hopefully, and again, the thing about this is that in this instance, the increase in the taxes is a temporary gimmick. It is used to tide us through that inflation, and those taxes will drop down as soon as the economy is back at its potential rate. So it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. And a lot of people like to say that if we would just reduce taxes, all of our economic issues would go away. However, hopefully what you've seen is that from an economics point of view, while reducing taxes is helpful if we're in a recession, it's not the better tool. The better tool is to increase spending. And in this case, with inflation, holy Toledo, sometimes the right policy is to increase taxes. Remember, when you're looking at macroeconomics, you're not looking at what's good for an individual household or an individual company. We're trying to figure out what is going to create the greatest overall aggregate impact on the society. And that's the government's job. So, while this doesn't seem to bode well with certain ideas out there from an economics point of view, um, it hopefully you understand why some people would argue different things. So hopefully you enjoy this and have a good day.